Davis Guggenheim, welcome back to Top Docs.
Oh, it's so nice to be on your show. I listen to it all the time, and it's my favorite source about documentaries I haven't seen that I know I should see.
Wow, well, thank you. We'll take the flattery, and thanks for being back. Still was a great film that we really enjoyed. Michael and I really enjoyed talking to you about Still last year. And Nyle DiMarco, welcome to Top Docs for the first time.
Thanks so much for having me. It's good to be here.
It's great to have you. And we did have Matt Oggins on talking about Audible. So I know that you were producer of Audible, and that's a great doc as well. So maybe we can add that as a hidden gem.
Yeah, definitely. It was nominated for an Oscar at the same time as Coda, and it was a really special moment, I think.
Absolutely. So just a note for the audience, Nyle has an interpreter signing for him, and there's an interpreter who's vocalizing his answers for me. So let's go ahead and jump in. First of all, because I think I said this before we were actually on air. Congratulations on the film. I really loved it. The story's riveting. The creative approach and the execution are terrific. And the added, perspective of, the film coming out, making the film now, decades later, really adds layers of depth and meaning and relevance to these events. So congratulations to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So how did this project come together with the two of you as directors? And Nyle, do you want to take that first?
Certainly. Long story short, I actually brought this project initially to Jonathan King, who was leading the scripted side of Concordia. And when I was telling him the story of Deaf President Now, he was stunned to know that he didn't know anything about this incredible civil rights movement and this history that has essentially been erased from textbooks. So we began working on a scripted version first. We hired a couple writers, and once we had a look at the first draft, we had a few concerns and went back, and with the second draft, our concerns were sort of cemented. We knew that, within that format, we couldn't do as much of a deep dive. We wouldn't be able to really analyze the experience of deaf people and the oppressive dynamics and the discrimination that we've all faced for years. And that was a big part of why I ended up meeting with Davis. I brought it to him, and he said, "This absolutely needs to be a doc." This protest was about so much more than just appointing a deaf president, and that format really lent itself to being able to make it a rich film. But our biggest concern and question was whether or not we would be able to get enough archive. But we were very lucky to find out that Gallaudet had been sitting on over 40 hours of footage that could have been a doc in and of itself. And in our earliest discussions about how we could stay true to the story that is Deaf President Now and be respectful of the themes in telling the story, we decided it would be best to co-direct. It was my first time, my directorial debut, and this was Davis's first time ever co-directing, and the rest is really history, right?
Yeah, and when I read the script, I was kind of excited. I used to be a scripted director for a long time. I did a lot of TV shows and some movies and Deadwood, and I was like, okay, this could be cool. It's a real historical event. But then when I read the script, I was like, I need to know what actually happened. And I was like reading the script and then reading the factual events, and I was like, wait a minute, this doesn't feel right. And I quickly asked, like, how's the archive? And the archive was amazing. And I was like, how is it that this story has been buried for so long? If you're African American in this country, Selma is this cornerstone story to your memory. If you're deaf, Deaf President Now is this cornerstone memory, but it has been totally forgotten in mainstream culture. In deaf culture, it's taught to every child in school, but in hearing culture, not so much, or not at all. And I go, the real events are just too important. You need to know that this actually happened. And then as we're making the film, these protests are happening all around the country. And we're watching a very, very different tenor and tone to those protests. And we both started talking about, wow, there's something going on at Gallaudet in 1988 that we could really learn from.
Absolutely. Yeah, the footage from Gallaudet, and specifically of the protests, the rallies, the victory moments, it's not only really compelling, but you see something going on and you're like, what's unique about it and what can be applied potentially to other situations.
And you could feel in that script these attempts to make it very Hollywood. One of the characters is waking up in bed with his girlfriend and people are banging on his window, they're going to announce the president. And then one of the characters gets really angry and burns down the lacrosse shed. And none of that's true. And sometimes true is even more dramatic than something a Hollywood writer can conjure.
I agree. And it's interesting that you bring up Selma, because I think another similarity is that the events in Selma, the Selma to Montgomery March, were very concentrated with ups and downs and victories and defeats within that time frame.
Yes.
Ultimately, it's a victory.
Yes.
And that is an analogous situation, I think, to these 8 days at Gallaudet 1988.
I love that you brought that up, because that was a very big choice that Nyle and I made together, which is like, what if we just cover these 8 days? What if the minute the movie starts, the action happens, and you just concentrate on that time. It neglects the fact that people were working on this for many, many years. But what if it played like an episode of 24, where you're just playing it minute to minute and thrust into the experience of these 4 characters?
Yeah, that works brilliantly. I did want to get back to your process, and so you decide you're going to direct this together. How did you decide who is going to do what, how you're going to split things up, and just kind of figure it all out? Nyle, do you want to take that first?
Yeah, I don't know if we really decided or drew a line in any sand. It really was a lot of discussion surrounding how we wanted to tell the story. Initially, I told Davis I wanted to do something that was different, that broke the mold, because as a deaf person growing up, I would see characters or storylines about deaf people on TV, and they were always the same tropes that they would recycle. Deaf audience watching would immediately be able to tell that a hearing person was the one who wrote our story. I wanted to change that. So we came up with the concept of visual noise, as well as the Deaf POV, where we wanted to force the hearing audience into what it looks like to be a deaf person and experience these things. So we would throw ideas together, and there was such a beautiful collaboration, I think, when my forte is obviously not sound. My ears don't work. So, I, of course, trusted Davis with the sound, and he trusted me with a lot of the visuals.
Yeah, well, Nyle told me this story about I just couldn't believe it. Nile's brother, his twin brother. Is it your twin brother who's a DJ?
Yep.
So Nile's a twin brother who's deaf, and is a DJ. And I'm like, what? Well, there's a room with really loud bass, and people are just vibing off these vibrations. It's like, wow, that's super interesting. And so we had a lot of conversations together. So in essence, we didn't split up tasks. We really did everything together, and we pushed each other. But I would really say that it's a new role for me, where I acted more like a midwife. You know, this is Nyle's idea. It's his university. It's his experience. It's his culture story. And here I am as someone who has delivered a lot of babies, but I'm helping him deliver his baby. And so a lot of that is like, how do you not make the same mistake that so many filmmakers have made, where hearing people come in and pretend they know the deaf experience? And so that was really just eye-opening for me, and really challenging, and many times uncomfortable for me to do that. And out of that uncomfortability, I think came out some really interesting things that we would never have done if we hadn't been working together.
It's interesting, yeah, you used that word uncomfortable, because I ran across this quote from you in the Hollywood Reporter about Still, your last feature, and you said, as a creative person, you can easily get stuck even when you're happy in that stuck place. There's nothing worse when you're at work and you feel like, I'm going to just do the same thing I did last time. I think as you get older, it's a little harder to take risks. It's a little harder to be in a creative place where you're uncomfortable. And I think you did pull that off with Still. You took creative risks and they paid off. And I think you did it again here with Deaf President Now.
Thank you.
Nyle, you mentioned visual noise and deaf point of view. Can you, for folks who haven't seen the film yet, can you talk a bit more about those two creative elements?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, growing up, any representation that I saw of my community on TV, it was always played with the same idea. Deaf people were something to be pitied because they didn't have a relationship with sound or with noise. And I wanted to flip that on its head. I wanted to find creative ways to show sound and to show noise in the environment, but in a visual way, the way that deaf people truly do experience it every day. Even though we might not be able to hear the same way that hearing people can, our world can be quite noisy, can be quite loud. In illustrating some of these things for Davis, he was really surprised. It's a thing that I think most hearing people just don't really consider. And I'm hoping that this project lays a new ground for other media for them to take the concept and build on it. I hope that both hearing and deaf people can experience this film and the sound within it in a very new way.
There's an amazing moment in the movie where Brigida, who is sort of the feminist in the group and a cheerleader, and she says, I hear nothing, but I can feel rhythm. And you see her pump her chest. And she describes how she was a cheerleader, and she would be a cheerleader from a drum beat and that energy from it. And when you see that scene, Nyle and I tried to capture what that scene must have been like. And what's so cool about it is it's not just a cheerleading thing. She used that as a way to bring a chaotic mob in the middle of the most important moment in the early parts of the protest, by actually using that feeling to get people to chant and move in a way that got the crowd focused on what they were trying to accomplish. It's a really good example of Deaf POV and the thing that Nyle was advocating. And that scene moves very radically between a hearing point of view and a deaf point of view, and back to a hearing point of view and back to deaf point of view. And it says to the audience, hey, be uncomfortable. This is what it's like, it was really exciting to do that. I'd never imagined you could do anything like that before in a documentary.
It's interesting. I love the opening of the film, and it begins with, a sequence that starts with Washington, D.C. traffic, horns blaring, and you intercut that with sort of the beginning, the setup of the interviews in a studio with our four principal characters, and you cut back to a shot, sirens wailing in DC, cut back to another interviewee, then you cut to the subway screeching, back to the interviewee. The interviewee sets are very quiet, almost silent when they're not speaking. So there's a great deal of contrast between loud, kind of disruptive sounds and silence or near silence. And after listening, to you both talk about deaf point of view, I'm like thinking those sounds of traffic and the subway screeching, is that the hearing point of view or the deaf point of view? I think you've kind of, in a way, taken us to a point where it could be either in a sense. But can you talk about that opening sequence?
Definitely. So, hearing people who have come to visit Gallaudet will tell you that it's a bit of a culture shock experience, because the sound really does sort of cut out on campus here. We're not a campus of talkers as much as we are of signers. And Nyle Davis playing with that design, basing it really in the heart of DC with the familiar sounds, and to be able to sort of throw folks into this tiny part of DC that is its own world. In order to sort of distinguish the two, you have to just give it the truth, which is that it's much quieter here than the rest of the city. It's almost like a different world within our country.
Yeah, and a third person should be sitting here, and that's Michael Hart, our editor. He was the editor on Still, a Michael J. Fox movie, and editor and producer of this movie. And he's just a one-of-a-kind talent. And so that sequence, the intercutting of those noisy sounds to the quiet interviews, was really, he came in one morning and cut it and showed it to Nyle, and they were like, wow, that's fantastic. The other thing we talked about was capturing that experience of going on to Gallaudet. The first day I was at Gallaudet, there's a coffee shop there, and I went in, and there's a line, and it's like, the room was like deadly silent, and I'm like, okay. And then, because I wasn't there and I was by myself, and I just like, and I'm waiting quietly. And then the person serving me coffee was deaf, and I was a fish out of water. I was like pointing to the menu, and I was like, oh, the roles have completely flipped the minute I walked onto Gallaudet. So that shot you see where the camera's pushing towards the gates of Gallaudet, and the minute it crosses that threshold, you go from the noisy sounds of DC into this other experience, which is a kind of silence, but not totally. Yeah.
Yeah, I love those two shots, the push in through the gates, which to me evokes the beginning of Citizen Kane, and then the shot of the campus again at night, which it looks like a miniature set. I mean, and it highlights just sort of the fairy tale aspect of the story and of this place. This sort of old Victorian style buildings, this doesn't feel quite real, and so in a sense you're taken into this story for these 8 days. It's like it's both kind of hyper real and not quite real, and you really set it up brilliantly.
Thank you.
Let's talk about your interviewees. So there's these 4 student leaders. They're all very distinct personalities, and they're all clearly, brilliant activists. Jerry, Greg, Tim, Brigetta are the 4. They're all interviewed separately, which isn't, particularly unusual, although I did find myself maybe being a little bit more aware of the separation in the interviews than normal. I can't even explain why. And that's not a bad thing at all. It was very effective and affecting. And I think that may have also been highlighted by the fact that you ask each of them to comment or describe one of the others. And then finally, I'd say it's wonderful that we not only see them however many years later, we're talking, 35 years later, but we see each of them in the archival footage. So that distance between then and now is so compelling. But can you talk about just your approach to the interviews and, you know, your decision to really only interview these four plus King Jordan? Nyle, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I'd love to. So before we even got into the individual interviews, we set up a Zoom call just to have sort of a casual chat with them as a group, and get some basic structural questions. And one of the things that we asked about were there any tensions or differences of opinion, or what did the internal dynamics look like? And they said, no, we got along great. We worked in harmony for a great week and we won. And I was like, this is going to be the worst movie, right? And it's also complete bullshit. Like I mentioned, I come from a deaf family, and, my parents are friends with, some of the four. I mean, we're a very tight community, and having heard this story again and again, you hear about the tensions that they had. So we realized that we needed to get them out of each other's way and sort of set up individual interviews and allow them to be vulnerable. We chose to focus on the four student leaders as a lens because it felt the best way that we would be able to add in the nuance and the layers. We brought in King Jordan as an exception to that lens because he is such a key figure. I mean, he is the one who became the first deaf president, and the university greatly benefited from him. He's also very interesting because he started off his life as a hearing person and ended as a deaf person.
Yeah, I think it's super interesting that, like, people who make documentaries about real people who do incredible things is they want to do this really, all this work and make them look incredible. And I think I'm much more interested in making people human. And Michael J. Fox told me that, like, he's walking down the street in New York and he falls down and he says to this woman, "You knocked me off my feet." He's making a joke, but he's also saying, don't look at me as a pathetic, pitiful person with Parkinson's. And that taught me a lot. And what Nyle and I really talked about was, like, how do you make these people real? And, they, even though it's 35 years later, they still have their pet peeves. They still hold some grudges. They didn't always get along. And that's what makes, I think, them so appealing and funny and fun. And then they become heroes by being ordinary people doing great things, which is much more interesting than seeing someone who's just so awesome all the time. I think people who are awesome all the time are annoying and don't exist.
Agreed.
I would also add that there's one shot in the film, and it's really the last shot, where there's a group hug in archival footage after they win. And that kind of tells you all you need to know about whether, these folks loved each other. Obviously they did. So let's talk about a villain here for a second. Jane Bassett Spielman, who was the chair of the board of Gallaudet. And she's the one that, announces that a hearing person is going to become the next president, Dr. Elizabeth Zinser. And, this news is met with a firestorm by the Gallaudet student body. And there's a scene, it's a great scene, where Spielman comes to the school to talk to the students who are assembled. And she basically just reiterates the board's decision. So she's not giving an inch at this point. Students are having none of that. Someone pulls a fire alarm and Spielman protests, we can't have this conversation because it's too noisy. But the point is made by but not for the deaf students. It's not too noisy. And, you know, Brigetta, one of the four, uses the term autist to describe Spielman in this moment. Can you explain, you know, what this term means and how, you know, she sort of exemplifies that in this moment?
Yeah, autism as a term essentially describes those folks who look down on deaf people simply because they can't hear, but it also speaks to our society's recollections about us. And, you know, Spillman thought she was doing what was best for the community. She thought she was doing what was best for Gallaudet University, and that was her responsibility as chairman of the board. You know, she really believed that she was leading the best way. But just because you have good intentions, you know, doesn't mean that your actions follow suit. You know, the head of the board still not knowing sign language is just one small reflection of sort of the general paternalistic nature and how we weren't heard. You know, it was very autist behavior, what we saw in the gym. And, you know, while she wanted what was best for us, what would have been best is had she come here and eat, slept, breathed ASL in our culture.
Yeah, and I want to explain something that needed explaining to me when I first heard of this project. I was like, well, deaf president now. I was like, why deaf president? Why do we need a deaf president? And when you come to this campus, first of all, it's like it's a mecca for the deaf community. But what I heard from the four that I interviewed is like when they would register for a class or they would go and talk to an administrator, they'd walk in the building over there. We're at Gallaudet right now. And they'd walk in and there'd be a hearing person they'd have to talk to. And the hearing person didn't sign because their boss didn't sign, and their boss is the president, and the president didn't sign. So here you have an organization that's being run by people who don't understand you. So it's fundamental to the experience of like, what is simply right? But it's as an outsider, you're like, why do we want a deaf president? And Spillman, when she comes to the gym that day, that gym is right over there. It's quite extraordinary because she basically comes in and says, we picked the right person. She's very qualified. She's a hearing person, but she has one thing that she doesn't have is she goes, she's very qualified, but despite this one small thing, which is that she has no experience with deaf people. And you're like, and so the students pull the fire alarms, which is a way that they've established to get people's attention. And the fire alarms are going off, the lights are blinking, and Spillman's standing there in front of the crowd, and they're screaming at her. And she says, and I don't even have to tell you, I don't have to tell you why this is so offensive, but she just says, it's awfully difficult to talk above all this loud noise. And we cut to our characters who are very peaceful and quiet. And Greg says, wasn't loud for me. If she could sign, it would be easy to talk. And that just sort of exemplifies her misunderstanding and also exemplifies how our style of cutting back from deaf to hearing point of view really helps. It's sort of essential to this because you have Spillman who's definitely coming at it from one side and our characters are coming at it from another.
Yeah, I think that scene is so rich also because it shows how, frankly, tone deaf she is, Spielman, and thinks and this is true of Zinser, I just need to talk to these students and then everything will be fine. They just need to get to know me. I need to get to know them.
Yeah.
No, talking isn't going to do it.
Yeah.
And it takes them the full 8 days to basically realize that.
Yes.
But what's incredible is, so I think she misreads the room.
Yes.
And then again, the students are such great organizers, strategists, that they flip the script, pull the alarm, and yes, that is a way they have of gathering the group, the tribe, and communicating. But what it also does is it weaponizes sound to silence this person who's in power and claim the power for themselves. And I don't know if that was intentional or inadvertent, but it does, for me, it has that effect.
Oh, I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I did want to talk about signing itself. You know, it's such an important part of the film. And, you know, one of the things that Jerry says about Greg is he signs small. And that is it's basically a criticism of Jerry. It's descriptive, but I think it's also, you know, in Jerry's mind, it's a criticism of Greg. But can you, Nyle, can you just talk about what the film says about signing and its importance?
Yeah. You know, I think you can't lead a protest with a whisper, right? And, you know, I think that's what Jerry is trying to say when he refers to Greg and sort of how he signs. You know, American Sign Language is made up of body language. When you're angry, you know, you throw your hands in the air. When you're sad or, you know, upset, you get small. And one thing that I do love about Tim actually is when he talks about his grandfather expecting small signs. You know, back then, I mean, even in my own family, my grandparents and their parents would oftentimes try to sign underneath a table to keep it discreet at a restaurant or in public spaces because they were trying to be mindful and worse, respectful of hearing people. Because at the time, sign language was considered primal, something that an ape might use. And, you know, at that time, really all of the DPN-4 were born around the 60s. And, you know, in 1965, it was the first time that ASL was actually recognized as a language formally with rules and syntax and grammar and structure. You know, they were born in a time where things were changing and where the community had a chance to reclaim part of our identity through our language. And it's interesting to see how much that has shifted over time.
We only have time for one more question, unfortunately, and I have like many that I would love to ask you about because there's so much in this film to talk about. I love the Nightline scene with Greg is just a great scene in the film, climax in many ways. But since we're running short on time, I'm just going to ask you, there's a certain sense, and this isn't unique to your film, but you know, there's a sense of inevitability about this in retrospect. You know, the students win. The events play out over the course of these 8 days. They win, and it just seems logical, you know. But could this have gone another way? You know, could the outcome have been different? And what does it say about these student leaders and the students, the entire student body, and those who allied themselves with them, that they succeeded?
Yeah, I love that question, actually. You know, the protest is so incredibly timely and I think resonates with what we see today. Students on campuses all around the country. And I think we're so polarized now, you know, as a society. Folks with different opinions and disagreements seem to not be able to get past that in service of a higher goal. I think Deaf President Now really speaks to the power of collective action, but also agreeing despite our differences and working, you know, for the purpose of fixing the larger systemic issues. You know, I think it feels like we can't win anymore with protests, but I also think for many of us, we forgot how they work. So I would hope that this film offers that as a subtle lesson to the audience.
Yeah, and I understand what you mean about it being inevitable, but it really wasn't. The night before that Nightline sequence you talk about, they really felt like all hope was lost, because there's this moment, which I won't give away, which is an incredible betrayal, something you wouldn't expect, something the audience would never expect, by someone they truly believed and they felt double-crossed by. And there were voices on the floor of the Congress saying, let's withdraw funding from Gallaudet. There were forces saying these students make Gallaudet look terrible. The police were getting ready to arrest everybody, and to just, take blowtorches to the gates and force their way in, like that's happened recently here in college campuses. So it could have gone, it's a day away of going absolutely the wrong way. And I think the experience I've had showing this film, it's funny, you make a film, you think this is a film, and then you take it out in the world and you learn when people watch it, oh, this is what it is. I thought it was this, but actually it's no longer Nyle and my film, it's the world's film, and they watch it, and people come out and say, oh my God, I needed this film today because of what I'm reading in the papers right now, and the tenor and tone of conversations and protests around the country. It feels impossible. It feels like there's so much hatred and bile. And they said, God, I'd forgotten a way we used to do things. I think this is a very important movie for my children to look at and say, no, this is how you do it. And this is how it gets done. And I'm just so grateful that Nyle brought this, he championed for all these years to try to get this story told. And how cool that he, like this single person, just said, I have to insist that the world pay attention. I'm just so completely grateful that you did that.
It's great to see you both, together at Gallaudet, which I didn't realize you were there, talking about the film and about this great collaboration between the two of you. It's really inspiring, as is the film. And I would just sort of say at the end of the film, people are chanting Deaf Power. So let's end on that note. Deaf Power.
Deaf Power.
What is it? Is this?
Yeah.
Thank you so much. It was really great.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Congratulations on the film, and hope to see you and talk to you again soon.
Likewise. Thank you so much.
For sure. Thanks.
Do you each have a hidden gem, a documentary you've seen in the past, or maybe more recently, that you think doesn't quite get the attention that it deserves? And Davis, we'll have you answer that first.
I'm going to give two. One is No Other Land, which won Best Documentary last year, but still doesn't have a distributor. I think for political reasons that are quite callous and cynical. It's a film that is critically acclaimed and not seen by enough people. And then the other one is one that was nominated, which is Black Box Diaries, a stunning film about courage and journalism in Japan. Both are just beautiful films that must be seen.
Great, thank you. And we did interviews with both directors for the podcast, so people can check those out.
Cool.
Nyle, how about you? Do you have a hidden gem?
Yeah, for me, I'd have to say Crip Camp. Every time I talk to people about the documentary on Netflix, no one seems to have seen it, and I think it's such an important film. And it's about how disability camps can help really build groups of activists and advocates who later really change the shape of American legislation and our system.
And it should be said that the co-director of Crip Camp mixed the sound for this movie, Jim Lebrecht, a brilliant filmmaker and advocate.
I'm so glad you mentioned that. Yeah, Jim is a terrific sound mixer, and that is a great film. And I certainly thought about it, Nyle, when I was watching your film. and especially sort of the unsung or undersung heroes in Crypt Camp, as well as the 4 Gallaudet students featured in your film.